Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nick Newman had always thought he had faced every nightmare a parent could know, but nothing prepared him for the horrifying reality that unfolded when he received the late-night message that would change everything. One short, trembling voicemail from his terrified son Noah whispering, "Help me, Daddy," before the line abruptly cut out, echoing in Nick's mind like a siren as he tried to understand what could have happened and who could have taken him. But within hours the truth began to unravel in the worst possible direction, leading Nick to discover the cruel and shocking plot involving none other than Phyllis and Matt Clark, figures from both his past and present, twisted together in a horrific web that threatened not only Noah's life but everything Nick had built. And as Nick drove through the dark, storm-soaked streets of Genoa City with a grim determination tightening his jaw, he replayed every argument, every confrontation, every warning sign he had brushed off, realizing in hindsight that from the moment Phyllis began spiraling out of control again, from the moment old grudges resurfaced and Matt reappeared in the shadows like a ghost from a decade the Newman family thought they had buried, the danger had been building all along, until now it was exploding in the most devastating way possible. And every mile the tires rolled across slick pavement only fueled his fear and fury as he realized Noah had been caught in the crossfire of revenge plots that had nothing to do with him. Nick's mind raced back to the earlier weeks when Phyllis had been unraveling, her jealousy, paranoia, and burning resentment toward Nick, and anyone she believed stood in the way of her position in Genoa City, growing like wildfire, leading her to make reckless decisions that left even those who loved her terrified. But at the time Nick thought it was emotional chaos, depression, and heartbreak, not the early signs of a calculated plan that would culminate in her helping Matt Clark, the same criminal who had once tortured and terrorized Nick himself, returned to settle old scores in a way far more sickening and personal than anyone could have imagined. For Matt had chosen the most vulnerable target to strike at Nick, his child, and Phyllis, broken and cornered by her own inner demons, her longing to feel in control again, had chosen to go along with a plan she convinced herself was justified, believing that Noah's temporary disappearance would force Nick to suffer the same pain she believed he had caused her, though deep down even she knew that this had spiraled far beyond anything she had intended. But by the time she realized the full horror of what Matt had planned, she was in far too deep to escape, and Matt held all the power, watching her, controlling her, twisting every moment with that signature grin that Nick remembered so vividly from the past. The grin that signaled something terrible was coming. Meanwhile Noah, locked away in the cold, abandoned industrial building on the edge of Genoa City, had tried to be brave, replaying memories of his father teaching him to never give up, convincing himself that his father would find him, though every metallic clang from the pipes and every mocking footstep in the hallway made his heart pound harder. But still he clung to hope, and that desperation fueled that voicemail message when for just 1 minute Matt had left the phone too close, allowing Noah to dial the one person he knew would never stop. Even death wouldn't stop Nick Newman when his children were in danger. And as Nick pulled up to the rickety loading dock, the only place the GPS coordinates led to after tracing the call, he saw the cracked windows and the wind whipping through broken glass, and something inside him snapped, not fear, but an icy resolve as he stepped out into the storm, every muscle in his body tightening, every memory of the hell Matt had once unleashed resurfacing with perfect clarity. And Nick knew that Matt had chosen this spot deliberately, a symbolic battleground for one final showdown. But what Matt didn't realize was that Nick was not the same frightened young man from years ago. He was a father now, a man who would burn the entire city to ash if someone harmed his child. He pushed open the rusted side door, the metal screaming on its hinges, the sound echoing through the vast building until it died into silence. But then he heard something faint, the muffled sound of someone sobbing. Noah and Nick moved quickly but quietly, trained now in crisis response and every instinct screaming at him to stay sharp because Matt always had traps, always had layers, always had steps planned in advance. But just as he rounded the corner, ready to break open the small room where Noah was being held, Matt stepped out of the shadows with a slow clap, his expression smug, like he had been rehearsing this moment for years. And Nick froze not out of fear but out of shock as he realized Phyllis was standing beside Matt, her eyes swollen from tears and sleeplessness, her hands shaking, and Nick did not know what hit him harder, the knowledge that Matt had taken his son or the sight of Phyllis standing there willingly. And as Matt launched into his long monologue taunting Nick, bringing up old crimes, old humiliation, old rivalries, every word dripping with hatred and twisted nostalgia. Nick barely listened, because he was looking at Phyllis, really looking at her, seeing her collapse under the weight of what she had done. Her expression silently pleading, not for forgiveness, but for him to get Noah out alive before Matt's madness consumed them all. She whispered that she never meant for it to go this far. That she just wanted Nick to understand her pain, that Matt had promised no one would get hurt, but Nick saw through it. Not cruelty but desperation, a woman manipulated into her worst impulses, and though part of him burned to scream at her, this was not the moment, because Noah's voice calling from behind the locked door jolted him back into focus, and Nick lunged forward, tackling Matt as the room erupted into violence, years of rage flooding through Nick as they fought, fists slamming against the cold floor, metal clanging as Nick finally overpowered him, slamming Matt against a support beam hard enough to knock the wind out of him, just long enough for Nick to wrestle the keys from his pocket, but Matt, ever the sadistic planner, pulled a hidden blade, slashing across Nick's side, blood soaking his shirt instantly, yet even that could not stop him, not with Noah crying out for help just feet away, and in that moment adrenaline overtook pain as Nick fought with feral determination, pinning Matt to the floor long enough to knock him unconscious. Breathless, dizzy from blood loss, Nick staggered to the door, fumbling with the keys until it swung open, and there was Noah tied to a chair, tears streaking his face as he whispered again, "Daddy," and Nick pulled him into his arms, holding him tight, promising over and over that he was safe, that he would never let anything separate them again. And behind them Phyllis stood frozen, watching the reunion with a shattered expression, realizing that no matter how this ended legally or socially, she had crossed a line there was no returning from, her voice trembling as she apologized, saying Matt had convinced her this was the only way, but even she now saw the truth, that she had allowed darkness to swallow her, that she had failed Noah, Nick, and herself, and she surrendered then, not to the police, not even to Nick, but to the crushing truth that she had become something she never imagined she could be. Nick looked at her with equal parts heartbreak and fury, telling her that while he could understand being emotionally broken, he could never understand endangering a child, their child, and he walked Noah out without another word, leaving Phyllis standing in the silent, decaying building as sirens in the distance signaled that justice was coming, and as Nick held Noah in the back of the ambulance, his shirt stained with both blood and rain, he whispered promises of healing, safety, family, swearing he would never ignore warning signs again, that he would build a life where no past ghost, no resurrected enemy, no emotional collapse could ever threaten his child's safety again, and Noah, exhausted but safe, clung to the one truth that had guided him through the darkness. His father had come for him, just like he always believed he would. As the ambulance raced toward Memorial Hospital, its lights cutting through the stormy night like shards of warning, Nick sat beside Noah, still holding his son's hand as if releasing it for even a second might allow the nightmare to return. And though the paramedics urged him to sit still so they could examine the gash across his ribs, Nick could barely focus on his own pain. His mind was consumed with the sounds of the abandoned warehouse still echoing, Matt's maniacal taunts, Phyllis's broken sobs, and Noah's desperate cry, all embedding themselves into Nick's memory like permanent scars. And as Noah leaned into his father's side, eyes fluttering between exhaustion and lingering fear, Nick whispered that everything would be okay, though deep inside he wondered if anything would ever truly return to normal after what had happened. When they reached the ER entrance, Nick lifted Noah gently from the gurney, ignoring the blood soaking into his shirt as doctors met them at the doorway, pulling Noah away for monitoring and trauma evaluation, leaving Nick standing in the harsh fluorescent hallway with shaking hands, adrenaline draining and pain rushing in all at once. But before he could collapse into the nearby chair, Sharon rushed through the sliding doors, having been notified by police once the rescue was confirmed, and the moment she saw Nick covered in blood she froze, fear twisting her features until he assured her it was mostly his, not Noah's, and Sharon's knees nearly gave out from relief. She demanded to know how this happened, who did it, and when Nick told her, Matt Clark, and then with barely a voice added, Phyllis helped him. Sharon felt the floor shift beneath her, unable to comprehend how the woman who once fought for her children could have allowed herself to descend into darkness so extreme that kidnapping a young man became justified in her mind, and Sharon immediately placed her hand over her mouth, trembling with the weight of what this meant, not only for their families but for Genoa City itself, because Phyllis Summers had spent decades fighting demons, battles, obsessions, and rivalries. But this crossed a line that would not quietly fade when the headlines rolled away. Meanwhile, back at the warehouse, Red and blue lights flashed across the wet pavement as police poured into the building, guns drawn. Storming the shadows Nick and Matt had battled in only minutes earlier, and when officers reached the basement Matt was just beginning to regain consciousness, groggy and infuriated as they snapped cuffs around his wrists, reading him his rights while paramedics attempted to assess head trauma. But instead of struggling, Matt broke into laughter, cold and venomous, claiming this was only the beginning, that Nick still had so much to lose, that pain bred pain and the cycle was far from over. Though internally even Matt knew this would likely be the last time he saw freedom, the law finally closing in harder than ever before. Phyllis, however, did not fight or rant or resist. She stood motionless against the concrete wall, almost dissociated, her soul detached from the chaos as officers approached and asked her to turn around and put her hands behind her back, and her voice trembled as she whispered she never meant for Noah to get hurt, that she just wanted someone to feel her pain, that Matt had played upon her grief, insecurity, jealousy, and emotional decay until she could no longer see the line between revenge and madness. But the detectives didn't respond with sympathy, because no rationale, no emotional breakdown, no betrayal of her own values could excuse letting a child be terrorized. And they escorted her out while camera crews, tipped off within minutes, swarmed the parking lot, capturing footage that would dominate morning news broadcasts. Phyllis Summers, red-haired titan of Genoa City ambition, being led away in handcuffs as rain poured down her face, half concealing the tears she didn't bother to wipe away. Back at the hospital, Sharon sat with Nick in the quiet family waiting room while Noah underwent tests, and although doctors assured them that aside from dehydration, shock, and superficial bruising, Noah would physically recover, the emotional trauma remained unspoken but heavy between them. Sharon asked what set this spiral in motion, how Phyllis had become entangled in such darkness, and Nick admitted he had seen the signs: paranoia, mood swings, jealousy, and an increasing obsession with anyone she believed was taking from her. But he never thought she would reach a point of no return, never imagined she would align herself with the man who once destroyed so many lives. And Sharon squeezed his hand softly, telling him that he was not to blame, that Phyllis made her decisions, and while mental anguish could explain her actions, it could never justify them. Nick leaned back, exhausted, eyes burning as he imagined the legal battles ahead. The media storm, the public speculation, dissecting every word, every past fight, every parenting decision, and he knew Phyllis would need representation, likely Michael Baldwin or Christine Williams or someone else accustomed to defending the morally ambiguous elite of Genoa City, but even the best legal minds would struggle to spin kidnapping into something forgivable, and Nick dreaded the trial, the testimonies, the possibility of Noah being asked to testify publicly about what happened. Meanwhile Noah, resting in a private recovery room, stared at the ceiling while nurses checked vitals and hydration, replaying the warehouse in his mind. The cold pipes, Matt's unhinged whispers, the hopeless moments where the silence felt eternal, and then the moment the door burst open and his father stormed in like a force of nature. Old B. A memory that was equally terrifying and comforting. Noah wondered how long it would take before he slept without nightmares, without hearing Matt's voice in the darkness, without remembering how Phyllis looked when she walked into the room, conflicted, guilty, yet still responsible for standing by when he needed someone to stop the madness. And though part of Noah wanted to hate her, to never forgive her, another part, the part raised by the complicated emotional histories of Genoa City's families, understood that Phyllis had been unraveling for months, that she had been consumed by feelings she never addressed, that she had reached a place where she was no longer thinking clearly. But trauma does not analyze rationality, and pain does not give free passes, so Noah closed his eyes and allowed the exhaustion to consume him, letting the hospital's quiet lull him into a temporary sense of safety. Hours later, Victor Newman arrived, having flown in from a business trip the moment he heard what happened, and when he entered the hospital lobby, the employees, nurses, and even visitors felt the shift in energy that always accompanied Victor Newman's presence. The tense posture, the narrowed eyes, the smoldering aura of a man who had built empires and defended them without mercy. When Nick stood to greet him, Victor saw the bandages around his son's torso, the exhaustion in his eyes, and, though the two had clashed many times before, father and son embraced briefly, a silent acknowledgement that family unity mattered now more than ever. Victor demanded details, and when Nick told him that Matt and Phyllis were involved, Victor's expression grew thunderous, because Matt's name was synonymous with ancient wounds the Newmans had buried long ago, and the thought of him rising from the ashes to inflict new pain was more than Victor could tolerate. He vowed that Matt would never again step foot in Genoa City after prison took him, and as for Phyllis, Victor's reaction was more complicated, because although he had respected and even admired her strength at times, betrayal of a Newman child was something he would never forget. If she survived the legal battle, she would still face a city where Victor Newman ensured doors closed for her. Across town, Lauren Fenmore sat at home, watching the emergency broadcast as footage of Phyllis being loaded into the squad car replayed over and over, and her heart sank, not because she believed Phyllis was innocent, but because she knew how fragile Phyllis's emotional stability had been in recent months, and she feared that without intervention, therapy, and a complete re-examination of her life, Phyllis might not survive prison life mentally or physically. She called Michael Baldwin, immediately, insisting he represent Phyllis, not because she needed protection from consequences, but because she needed someone to stop her from completely self-destructing. At the GCPD station, Kevin Fisher brought Phyllis a blanket as she sat shivering in the holding cell, staring at the wall, silently replaying decisions that now appeared monstrous even to her own mind. She remembered the first night Matt showed up, the vulnerability she felt, the anger, the sense of being cornered by her life falling apart, and in her desperation she clung to the one person who fed her narrative, even if that person had a notorious history of psychological manipulation. Mistake she now recognized too late, and when Christine finally approached the cell to speak with her, Phyllis whispered that she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted the chance to explain how everything spiraled, and Christine, though sympathetic, reminded her that explanations were not absolution, and that the courts would decide her fate. Back at the hospital, the sun began rising, casting gold light on hallways once shadowed by panic, and Nick finally stepped into Noah's room again, watching his son sleep peacefully at last. As he sat down beside the bed, Nick allowed himself for the first time to break, his shoulders shaking silently, tears falling into his bruised hands, the weight of the last 24 hours finally crushing into his chest, and in that moment he didn't feel like a CEO, a Newman, or a man groomed for power. He felt only like a father who had nearly lost his child, a father trying to grasp how someone he once trusted had become the threat he never expected. Sharon entered quietly, resting a hand on Nick's back, telling him that breaking down didn't make him weak, it made him human, and Nick took a trembling breath, realizing that this was the first step toward healing, admitting that even the strongest in Genoa City bleed when the ones they love are in danger. But he also knew the next steps, court cases, media scrutiny, emotional fallout, were only just beginning, and as the monitor beside Noah beeped steadily, signaling that he was alive and safe, Nick swore silently to his son, to himself, and to the universe that nothing like this would ever happen again, because family was everything, and he would rebuild whatever had broken, even if it meant facing every ghost from his past head-on, no matter how painful or ruthless the path ahead. When morning finally settled over Genoa City and the hospital quieted into the slow rhythm of a new day, Nick Newman stepped out of Noah's room for the first time in hours, running a hand across his tired face, knowing that although his son was safe for the moment, the world outside those walls was shifting into a battle that would consume not only the Newmans and Phyllis Summers but every connected soul in Genoa City who found their lives entangled in this web, because news helicopters were already circling the skyline. Journalists camped outside GCPD headquarters, headlines plastered across every local network and website. Phyllis Summers arrested in kidnapping plot, and Nick realized they were no longer dealing with a private tragedy but a storm of public scrutiny that would tear open old rivalries, alliances, grudges, and wounds in a way no one could predict. Meanwhile, Victor had left the hospital at dawn and headed straight to Newman Enterprises, summoning his legal and crisis teams with an intensity that shook the building, asserting that the Newmans would not allow Matt Clark, or anyone aligned with him, to humiliate their family again, vowing that their legacy would not be defined by the actions of old ghosts or broken hearts. And while his ambition had always been driven by empire and legacy, this time it was driven by something far more primal, the thought of his grandson being taken by a man who should have been behind bars forever. And Victor, who had spent a lifetime raising children in a world of enemies, now saw this as a personal declaration of war. At the same time, Sharon remained at Noah's side, brushing back his hair as doctors performed a psychological assessment, explaining gently that trauma this severe often left longer-lasting marks than visible injuries, and Sharon, who had weathered her own share of emotional storms, swore silently that Noah would not endure this alone, that she would help him heal in ways she had once been too broken to manage for herself, and she felt a renewed resoluteness forming in her heart. A mother's armor reforging itself, determined to protect her child's peace. But Noah, awake and staring at the window as the morning sun cast a watery glow over the room, was lost in a mental replay of the warehouse. The sound of dripping pipes, Matt's cold voice, Phyllis appearing in the doorway with trembling hands, and Noah kept wondering when exactly the woman he had once hugged at Christmas, the woman who baked him birthday cake and fought every enemy who threatened the Newman clan, lost herself so completely that she could allow something like this to happen, and his chest tightened with a confusion he could not yet name. Anger, grief, betrayal, heartbreak, but also a small kernel of pity, because Noah had heard the tremor in her voice, had seen the war behind her eyes, a woman not evil by design but broken by a lifetime of internal storms she had never allowed herself to process.